Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Don Going, CEO of Vertex Consulting. I appreciate you joining with me today. We have Marc Laliberte, the Senior Security Analyst from WatchGuard Technologies. Our content today is going to focus primarily on the 5 most critical threats that we see for 2020. But I do want to tee up the conversation to give you just some big picture perspective. Number one, as we all know, the incidence of cybersecurity attacks are rapidly increasing. That's no surprise. And the attacks are morphing as our defenses change. That's kind of also no surprise. But I do think a couple of the things that Marc is bringing to the presentation today in his briefing are going to be somewhat of a surprise, mostly because his research and analysis shows that these top 5 threats include a few threats that have really accelerated recently. I've known Marc for quite a while. Every time we have Marc present to our clients, it's always a well-received event. We always get a lot of positive feedback. I'm glad Marc was able to dedicate the time to join us on the webinar today. I am recording this webinar. I will download it and then post it up on YouTube later today or tomorrow. I'll send out a link to that. We've also created a PDF of the PowerPoint Marc will use. I've posted that in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar tools, so you can download it yourself and have it. And I'd be glad to send it to you in an email if you aren't able to download the handout. I'll be monitoring the chat and questions windows to make sure that we're integrating your feedback and answering your questions throughout the presentation. And want to keep it as interactive as we can. So Marc will kind of pause periodically to make sure we're getting those questions addressed. With that, Marc, I'd like to turn it over to you to give your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Don, and thanks everyone for hopping on. Like Don mentioned, I'm going to go through a few of the top cyber threats that we got to watch out for the coming years, some stats to back it up, and some of the threat intelligence that WatchGuard Threat Lab has been able to pull together from our security appliances deployed throughout the world. Before I jump in, I want to share a little bit of exciting news from the world of WatchGuard right now. You may have heard this week, we entered a definitive agreement to acquire Panda Security, who's an endpoint security company based out of Spain. We're really excited for this acquisition, pending regulatory approval, of course, and it's going to be a great opportunity for us to bring our network security down to the endpoint in ways that we haven't been able to previously. So keep an eye on that one. We're going to have some really cool stuff coming out here in the next few months, thanks to this acquisition. So let's hop into the main webinar now. Real quick about me. I've been a WatchGuard for about 8 years now in a few different roles and responsibilities. Right now, though, I'm the manager of the WatchGuard Threat Lab, our threat research team, who's dedicated to taking the threat intelligence that we receive from third-party feeds and our own security appliances deployed throughout the world and trying to build a picture of what the threat landscape looks like. We put out quarterly reports, our internet security report every quarter, daily blog posts on secplicity.org, and webinars like this to try and make sure you guys are educated on what you need to help defend your networks against. I come from a lifetime of traditional hacking, so that's ripping apart VCRs and TVs and computers that my parents brought home while growing up. Learned a lot from that. Now my main specialties are network security, obviously, working at WatchGuard, and Internet of Things is another big passion of mine. When I'm not traveling the world, speaking at conferences, my main research focuses on buying whatever the latest network-connected gadget is from Amazon and trying to find vulnerabilities in it, and then working with the manufacturers to get those resolved. It's a pretty fun gig back at the office. So agenda for today, we'll go over some threat landscape statistics, some general attack trends, and numbers that are important for you guys when it comes to security, and then we'll jump right into the top 5 cyber threats for 2020. 5 main bucketed areas of things that you need to watch out for when it comes to cyber attacks. And then once I've kind of given you a little bit of a scare, we'll end with how to actually defend against these threats with some good tips and techniques and tools you can use to keep your network safe. So without further ado, let's hop into the threat landscape by the numbers. And really the first thing I want to highlight is this research here from Poneman Institute, who put out the study called the Data Breach Report, or Cost of a Data Breach Report every year, usually partnered with IBM, where they're able to go and get information from known data breaches and build a pretty good picture of what it looks like across the world in terms of cost, damages and how the attackers actually get in. And this number is really important to show here, being the cost per record of a breach. Because we tend to hear a lot about the massive breaches, like the Anthem breach, Target, the ones that affect massive companies and cause millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions in damages. And it can be easy for us to kind of wave those away and say, oh, well, that's Target. Like, of course they're going to be attacked, and of course they're going to lose tons of millions of dollars from that. Why does it matter to me, though, as a small or medium organization? And really, the cost still adds up, even if you are a smaller organization. We're looking at $150 globally per record when a breach occurs, and in the United States, it's even worse. It's $242 per record. And that means that even if you're like a small shop, maybe you have a couple hundred customers, a couple thousand customers, if you're doing really well, if someone's able to go in there and steal your customer records or your employee records, that number still really adds up, because you have to factor in the cost of bringing in someone to consult with to identify how the breach occurred, cleaning up after the fact, lost revenue from downtime if it's like a ransomware attack that's locked you out of your systems, the reputation hit if your customers find out that you've been the victim of a breach, which you typically have to report. It all adds up to be still thousands or even millions of dollars, even for a small organization. And when it comes to identifying that we've been the victim of a breach, as an industry, we're really not doing that great of a job. This is also from Poneman Institute's Cost of a Data Breach report, where they have this mean time to identify number, which tracks the time from when a breach occurs to the time where the breach has been detected on a network or on a system. And for 2019, that mean time to identify was 206 days. So we're talking like 8-9 months from the point where an attacker has breached your network and gotten a foothold on the system to the point where you've realized you've been the victim of a breach. And during that time, it allows the attacker to map out all of your critical systems, start siphoning data out of your network. Maybe they can use compromised credentials to then turn and phish your customers or the partners you work with. And even once you've identified you've been the victim of a breach and there's someone on your network, it still took another 73 days on top of that to clean up after the fact. So now we're talking 270 days, like 9-10 months from the point of infection to the point where you get the attacker off of your network. And I'll highlight why this is the case towards the end of the presentation, but really it boils down to too many organizations focus all of their time and attention on trying to prevent attacks and not enough on identifying things that slip through the cracks. And another big issue we're having right now when it comes to the threat landscape is this massive skills shortage in cybersecurity. The cybersecurity skills gap for the next year, most analysts predict it'll be around 3.5 to 4.5 million unfilled positions in the coming year. And that causes a big problem for even organizations that might be large enough to have their own IT team. They're not going to be able to afford to have security experts on that team to identify when you've been the victim of a breach, identify threat trends, and make sure your defenses are configured properly to defend against them. That means that it's a really great opportunity to work with service providers who do have those security teams in place to help keep you safe from the threat landscape that's out there. Now, one of the numbers that my team tracks in our quarterly reports every 3 months and then every single day on our threat landscape page is this thing that we call the 0-day malware number. And I like highlighting it because it just shows how evasive and sophisticated malware has become these days. Now, when we say 0-day malware, we're not saying malware that exploits a 0-day unpatched vulnerability. What we're saying is this is malware that does not have a signature or it gets past signature-based anti-malware services. And for the last month, February 3rd through March 3rd, when I pulled this slide out, that 0-day malware number was 57%, which means that if you're relying just on signature-based anti-malware detection tools, you're missing over half of all malware that's targeting your networks, which is frankly insane. And we've seen this as high as 60, 70% during some weeks, but really never any lower than 40% or so. And this is really fueled by a lot of tools that are available now for even unskilled attackers to make their malware evasive. They can take an off-the-shelf ransomware payload that's been around for several years and run it through some of these tools with just a few clicks, and suddenly it's able to get past a lot of legacy anti-malware detection services. Now, that was the stats. I want to jump right into the top 5 threat categories now that we need to watch out for in the coming year. And really, it boils down to these 5 main categories. We'll start with spear phishing, which is still the leading cause of breaches, and most likely will remain the leading cause of breaches because it exploits one of our weakest links in security, that being our end users. Next up is ransomware, which annoyingly is just not going away. And we'll talk about some of the evolutions that ransomware has had in the past few years. After that's a bit of a technical one, fileless malware. I'll give a good explanation on that and how it differs from the traditional malware that we've seen in previous years. And then account takeovers and account compromises. So credential theft, password misuse is another main threat category. And then finally, remote employees is one that we have to watch out for because millennials like me hate going into the office. And that means that we are missing out on a lot of perimeter-based security. We need to make sure that we're still securing those systems even if they're off of our network. So without any further ado, let's hop into spear phishing. And really, phishing's been around for quite some time. We used to get those emails, saying that, oh, I'm a Nigerian prince, and if you give me $5,000 to get me out of jail, I can give you $10 million in another week. And really, we've gotten pretty good as users as recognizing that those are a bit bogus, which means the attackers have started stepping up their game now to make their phishing emails much more believable. We started seeing notable spear phishing start in the early 2010s, where now they're using messages targeted towards specific individuals or departments within a company. And they've been using this style of attack to great success. Like RSA's breach back in 2011 was because of a spear phish. The Anthem breach back in 2015 started with a spear phish. The Democratic National Convention hack back in 2016 started with a spear phish. And some of the ways that cyber criminals are fueling these phishing messages involve social network recon. So they'll go on Facebook, LinkedIn, and your company organizational charts, figure out who you work for, who you work with, who your friends are, who you're related to. And then they'll use things like brand impersonation to spoof messages to look like they're coming from one place. And using their recon, they'll be able to craft these messages to sound like they're coming from the correct individual. It might fit the context of your organization, whatever the request is. It might come in at the right time for, say, like a money transfer around a home purchase or a large contractual purchase with a vendor. And it makes them a lot more believable and makes it much easier for your users to fall victim to them. And the fallout from these spear phishes are massive. Like 90 to 95% of breaches these days start with a spear phish. But interestingly enough, the vast majority of these phishes aren't using a link to try and get you to go to some shady website and give credentials. They're still using files to, say, drop malware on your computer that gives them remote access. Maybe it's got a keylogger to steal your password that way. Or maybe they're just trying to drop ransomware on your system and make a quick buck. It is still the leading cause of account takeover. So even if 94% of spear phishes are using files and not links, those links still do a great job of tricking people into willingly giving up their passwords. Or maybe if they are using a file, they're using a tool like Mimikatz to steal passwords straight out of the memory of your system. 28% of phishing these days is targeted. So it's easier than ever for attackers to build these messages targeted towards specific individuals using information they found on them online. And it's working really well. 30% of people tend to click on spear phishes or tend to open spear phishes, and 14% of them click, which is, in terms of success rates, absolutely massive. Here's an example of some phishing domains that we've been seeing from our own threat intelligence from our DNS Watch product, where we're able to neuter these links before your users end up visiting whatever the phishing website is, and then behind the scenes we can go and investigate and figure out exactly what they're doing. And we started seeing about a year ago a lot of links going to websites just like this, where the link will contain the email address of the recipient, so it can automatically populate this little form right here. and it looks like it might be a valid Microsoft login. Usually they're under the guise of trying to share a file with you that you have to go log in for. And then they trick you into giving up your password willingly, thinking that you're logging into a Microsoft service. Now, the one thing I really want to highlight out of here that's most frightening is that this is actually hosted on a valid Microsoft domain. Windows.net is owned by Microsoft. And the way they're able to do this is that a lot of these cloud hosting providers like Microsoft and Amazon and Cloudflare allow you to register your own subdomain on their cloud hosting platform and then put whatever you want up there in the cloud. So in this case, the attacker registered this service manager 00 subdomain and then stuck up an HTML file in the cloud in order to build this basically website that looks like it's hosted on the Microsoft domain. And this is frightening because we used to always tell our users, oh, just highlight over the link, and if it looks like it's going to a legitimate website, it's probably safe. And that's just simply not the case anymore. We can't trust that if you're going to a legitimate looking website link, that doesn't necessarily mean it's safe, because attackers could compromise that website, or in this case, set up their own subdomain and then host whatever they want. We've also started seeing phishing emails coming like this. I kind of recreated this one to protect the identity of the actual recipient of the message, but I thought this was actually kind of interesting. This was a legitimate phish we got where the attacker made it look like they were replying to a previous conversation that you had with them. Like they'll spoof some other message or some other email and then say, oh yeah, thanks for your business. We appreciate it. I've attached the invoice or whatever. And if you're a really busy individual, a busy employee, you might just think, oh, I don't really remember that, but maybe I was working with them. And that might get you to open this Word document, for example, which once we submitted it up to the cloud for analysis, we found that that Word document would try and use macros to spawn PowerShell and then use that to install a remote access Trojan on the computer, all from a very simple phishing email. So next up is ransomware. And this one, I'm sure all you guys are sick of hearing about ransomware. It's been around for quite some time now. We started seeing the shotgun blast ransomware really plateau back in 2015, 2016. This is where it felt like everyone and their mom was getting ransomware and having to pay the $100 or $200 in order to get access to their files back. But we as an industry have gotten better, whether it be through better backup and restoration services or better user training, to make that style of ransomware a lot less effective now. So instead, cyber criminals are evolving their threat trends. They're going after specific verticals. They're making ransomware virulent, like WannaCry, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. And then they're going after organizations that cannot stand to have any downtime whatsoever, like healthcare and state and local governments. It's even easier than ever now for them to make this ransomware evasive, to get past the traditional anti-malware services that people tend to use. It's even easy for someone with no hacking or development cred or experience whatsoever to launch their own ransomware attack with things like ransomware as a service, where you can hop on the dark web or even the not so dark web, hire someone to create the infrastructure and the payloads and everything for your ransomware attack, and then you just have to deliver it. And they take like a 10-20% slice off the top of any ransom payments. Funny enough, or frightening enough, I guess it's pretty funny, a lot of these ransomware as a service tools actually have their own dedicated help desk team, where if you're having trouble with your ransomware payload or infrastructure, you can hop on a chat line and get tech support for it, which is kind of sad that that's where we're at now. We're seeing ransomware that targets backups specifically, so it won't just start encrypting your files right away. It'll kind of lay silent on your computer and map out what network storage you have, what backup solutions you're using, and then find ways to compromise and deactivate or disable or delete them before it starts locking up your files so you can't recover. And we're also seeing ransomware payloads that'll try and disable any security processes running on the system before it starts encrypting too, to make sure their chances of success are much higher. They're going after, like I said, specific verticals, really targeted attacks now. Healthcare, state, local government, and industrial control are all really big targets. And because these attacks are targeted, they tend to demand much more in ransom payments too, like tens of thousands or millions of dollars now, depending on the size of the organization.
If I
and
could,
one thing I want to point out.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to point out is that paying the ransom doesn't guarantee you're going to get your files back. All it guarantees is that that criminal now has additional funding and incentive to carry out further attacks. Did we have a question come through, Don?
No, I was actually going to make a comment about what you were talking about, latest evolutions and tactics and trends. One of the things we've also seen, and I'm sure you were going to talk about it, but the issue we've run into lately is specialty cloud providers themselves are being ransomwared to get their downstream clients. So this week, Vertex received a call for us to help somebody mitigate ransomware, and it was a specialty cloud provider for veterinary clinics. They had about 270 different vet customers around the country, and they hosted their remote control systems and had remote access into these vet practices to manage their vet practice management software. The ransomware hackers got into the overarching software provider, then used the remote access tools to get to their 270 clients, and then did an encryption attack against all 270 of them using the leverage of the remote software provider. So if you're partnering with third parties that have specialty software for your industry, whether that be the veterinary industry, we had another one a couple weeks back, which was nonprofit. It was using a cloud-based data center service focused on nonprofits. That is a very alarming trend because now they're able to go get 250, 300, 500 different networks at once because all of them are using the same kind of specialty software provider who has support into their network that's got remote control that allows them to get in and encrypt your stuff. So just be careful that your network of protection now extends to your suppliers. And
exactly.
The very last one is we did see an attack earlier in the year from a building facility management company that had about 3,500 customers. They managed their HVAC, cooling, and refrigeration systems around the country. They got attacked, and then they used remote control to get in about 2,500 of those customers and ransomware them as well. So just the supplier network is another propagation system being used by these ransomware attacks.
Yeah, and there's tons of examples of that even in just the last year. There was a cloud hosting, data hosting provider for small doctor or dental offices that was hit too last year and locked up several hundreds of their data. And the reason that criminals are going after these vendors and service providers like that is because, just like you said, Don, they can compromise one company and from their access hit hundreds of other companies with minimal effort. I kind of hinted at this earlier with WannaCry. So ransomware is starting to evolve now as well into ransom worms, where it takes a traditional ransomware payload and it adds a worm-like self-replicating property to it that allows that ransomware to spread automatically without any user interaction whatsoever. The best example and first example of this was WannaCry, where attackers took several zero-day vulnerabilities. Actually, at the time, they were finally patched vulnerabilities that were leaked from an organization known as the Shadow Brokers, who hacked into the NSA and stole them. And just by adding these vulnerabilities to a ransomware payload, they were able to cause billions of dollars globally from one single ransomware attack. One thing that WatchGuard Threat Lab does every year is we put out our security predictions. And one of our predictions, Don actually nailed right on the head here, is that we're predicting attackers are going to start going after the cloud now too when it comes to ransomware. So we've seen them go after specific verticals. We've seen them with their shotgun blast ransomware. But up until recently, we haven't really seen them go after like cloud-based storage solutions. And it just makes sense that that's going to be the next target for them going forward. So if you have cloud-based storage, make sure you keep it secured, the access controls, make sure you're using multi-factor authentication, anything you can to try and make sure that is safe from cyber criminals. So next up's a bit of a technical one. And I'll start by going over what makes fileless malware unique as opposed to traditional malware. So traditional malware all of the malicious code, the actions, the bad stuff that it's trying to do is all within a file that gets saved to your hard drive, saved to storage somewhere, and then it executes from there. And that first makes it easy to clean up. It means that you can just delete that file or delete any other files it created, and you've deleted the malware off the system. And it also means it's easier to detect by even legacy or traditional anti-malware services that just periodically scan your hard drive looking for malicious code or scan objects when files are created on the hard drive. It's a bit easier to detect. Because of that, we're seeing attackers now pivot over to fileless malware, where at no point in time is that malicious code saved onto your hard drive. It resides solely in memory on your system, which makes it much more difficult to detect by most endpoint anti-malware tools. Now, there's a few different ways that malicious code can get onto your system. The first one's kind of cheating, where it does actually use a file. It tends to start with an Office document or something that's capable of running a script, and then it'll launch like PowerShell in order to go grab the malicious code off of a command and control server, and then inject it into memory and run from there. And then the reason that this is still a type of fileless malware is that as soon as you open that document, it no longer cares if you delete that document. It's already started running its malicious actions in memory. It has ways to gain persistence in memory so that even if you delete that tainted document, you still have the malware infection on your system. Now, the more frightening version of fileless malware is where it exploits a software vulnerability in some application you use on your computer. So maybe you've got an outdated version of Internet Explorer, and you navigate to, maybe from a phishing link, a malicious website that's able to fingerprint that browser, note that it's got a code execution vulnerability in it, and then automatically exploit that vulnerability and basically take over that process. It can then use that to inject code into other running processes on your computer and really hide itself from a lot of traditional anti-malware tools. This one's much more difficult to detect. You need to make sure you have services that don't just look for new bad processes, but also watch your legitimate processes, so that if like calculator.exe suddenly starts spinning up Windows crypto libraries and enumerating all the files on your hard drive, it can set off some red flags and shut that down before it launches a ransomware and encrypts everything on your computer. Now, fileless malware has actually been around for quite some time. We started seeing memory-resident viruses back in the 80s. Some fileless network worms like CodeRed and SQL Slammer were really prolific during the early 2000s. And we've seen even more recently a lot of living off the land style attacks, where they're using the legitimate tools built into like Microsoft Windows, like PowerShell, in order to carry out attacks using things like PowerSploit, which is a set of PowerShell scripts that enables malware injection, or even PowerWare, which is a type of ransomware that's basically just a PowerShell script. We've seen fileless malware do things like DLL and memory injection, where they can compromise a legitimate process and basically take it over to do whatever they want. I mentioned a lot of use of legitimate Windows tools to help it spread, like PowerShell and NetSH. And we've also seen them attached to zero-day exploits now, where they'll go after unpatched vulnerabilities on your system. And because they're fileless, they're even more difficult to detect once they've gained a foothold. Really started picking up in around 2016 or so. And I mentioned it doesn't always, it's not always completely fileless. Sometimes it does start with a file, and in that case, it's often Office documents. We also saw some research from McAfee showing that PowerShell threats like fileless malware actually increased 460% in 2019.
Hey,
and
before you continue,
part of the reason,
if you back up a second there, I don't know if you're going to get to it in a minute, but we do have a question, and that is more about the tools used to either detect or protect against fileless malware. I know we got a whole section on protection, but while we're on the topic, if you want to fold some of that in.
Sure, yeah. So you want to look at tools like endpoint detection and response that have an agent that runs on your computer. And generally they start with like a baseline of what processes are running and what are good processes. Sometimes they use whitelists or blacklists to try and identify deviations from that baseline. But really they're supposed to sit there and just watch for suspicious activity. So WatchGuard, ours is called threat detection and response. And our agent will sit there. It's got a list of different behaviors and heuristics it looks for. If it starts seeing suspicious activity from even a good process, it'll start throwing up red flags. And if it hits a high enough threshold for that, it can even remediate automatically and say, kill that process or quarantine anything that it's touched, delete any registry entries it might have added to try and gain persistence. That's the type of defense you want to have on your system to try and stop fileless malware. Something like your traditional McAfee or Symantec or WebRoot antivirus software isn't going to stop this type of threat at all. A lot of these you can also stop at the perimeter too. So scanning Office documents as they come in to look for malicious code. Our proxy on the Firebox security appliance, for example, can even strip out macros from Office documents or prevent them from coming into the network in the first place. And you can also identify attempted exploits of vulnerabilities through network services and protect it that way too. Really, it boils down to a layered defense of a bunch of different tools to try and catch this really evasive and elusive malware. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So when it comes to fileless malware, this is some more Pullman Institute study from a few years back, but it's still accurate today, where they were tracking the growth of fileless malware-based attacks over recent years. And that blue bar chart, you can see it's been going up year after year. And that's largely because of the first bullet point here on the right, where 77% of successful attacks in recent years were using fileless malware. So it's working, and it's working disproportionately better than traditional malware, which is why we're seeing it grow so much. We started seeing it in our own threat intelligence a few years back, end of 2015, early 2016, with a type of attack that went after DDE, or Dynamic Data Execution. And if you're not familiar with this acronym, a good example of this is if you've ever taken a Excel spreadsheet and copied and pasted it into a Word document, you can go and update that spreadsheet, and it'll also update the Word document version of it. That's using this DDE protocol to facilitate that communication between applications. Now, you can also use DDE to say, launch command prompt and then launch an application, in this case, calculator as a proof of concept, but you could replace that with a piece of malware, for example. And the reason that this works so well is that it's kind of building off of the macro malware that we've seen for just about a decade now, where with macros, if you open up a Office document that has macros enabled, you get that big yellow security warning at the top that says, danger, security warning, this has macros, do you want to run them? And our end users and us are pretty good at now realizing, yeah, that's a security issue, we probably don't want to run that. With DDE though, you don't get that. You get this little gray box that says, this document contains links that may refer to other files. Do you want to update this document with data from those linked files? If I'm a unsuspecting user that just got a Word document and this popped up, I'd think, well, what the heck, I have no idea what that means, but I want to open this, so yes. Doesn't look like a security risk to me. And as soon as you hit yes on there, it allows DDE to execute and basically do whatever it wants, typically launching PowerShell and then going and grabbing a malicious payload and installing it on your computer straight into memory. Another big area for the coming year is account takeover, and this one's really been a long time coming. It seems like for the last decade, 2 decades or so, we've been alternating between like massive data breaches full of usernames and passwords, with some executive like Bill Gates saying passwords are dead, followed by an even larger breach with even millions of passwords, and then another executive saying passwords are dead, and then like the Yahoo breach with 1 billion passwords. Or, for example, we just got a hold of this collection of data breaches called Collections 1 through 5 last year. And there's actually a typo on this slide. It's not 2.2 billion passwords. It is 22 billion passwords that we were able to obtain for free on not even the dark web. And you can imagine that a cyber criminal with a little more money and looser morals can probably get a hold of even more credentials on the dark web. And they're using these credential databases and breaches in order to fuel other breaches going forward. Now, they can use techniques like password spraying, where they'll take an account and then just try the top 50 or top 100 most common passwords to pretty good success, because our users tend to be pretty bad at picking a strong and unique password for each account. They can also use credential stuffing, where they will use credentials like legitimate credentials from one service for a user, and then try those same credentials on other services. A good example of this was back in 2012. Cyber criminals breached LinkedIn and stole 117 million or so usernames and passwords. One of those accounts was a Dropbox.com email address. And it turns out that Dropbox employee, A, had a very weak password that the attacker was able to crack pretty quickly after stealing it from LinkedIn. And then B, reused that same exact password with their corporate Dropbox account. So the attacker that breached LinkedIn a few weeks later was able to log right into Dropbox using those stolen credentials and breach them as well. We're seeing them use malware tools as well, like Mimikatz and Windows Credential Editor, where if they can get them onto your computer, they can often steal your Microsoft Windows passwords straight out of memory in plain text. We've seen attacks that can bypass weaker multi-factor authentication, like SMS-based. A good example of this is the Reddit breach from last year, where they were using multi-factor authentication, but they were using SMS text-based multi-factor. And the attacker was able to first get valid credentials for a bunch of Reddit developers, and then call up their mobile phone provider and convince them to port over the phone number to a SIM card under the attacker's control, which meant they were then able to intercept those SMS-based messages and log right into the systems. I mentioned that Reddit breach. We've seen credential stuffing attacks against a lot of large organizations like Citrix, HSBC, and passwords are still a top factor when it comes to authentication in 2020. Like, passwords are not going to die anytime soon, and we need to do a better job of making sure we secure them. Some of this is backed up by data from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, for example. In their latest report, they found that 70% of hacking-related breaches leveraged stolen credentials in 2019. And these credentials are really fueled, like I said, by those databases available on the dark web and even the not-so-dark web. A few years ago now, this would have been back in 2017, we got a hold of 1 billion usernames and passwords in plain text, which at the time we thought, oh man, this is insane. How are we able to get this many? I mentioned now we have 22 billion in our database, but back then we actually ran an analysis on this database, and we looked specifically into email addresses that ended in .gov or .mil. So government and military, the accounts that you would hope have really good password practices. We found that actually less than 0.1% of those addresses used one of the top 50 most common passwords, which is pretty impressive. I was really happy to see that. Unfortunately, though, when it came to password length, the majority of them hovered right around 8 characters. And I don't really care how many numbers, symbols, uppercase, lowercase letters you have. If your password is 8 characters or less, I can crack that in less than 1 day on my laptop right here. Even like 9, 10 characters, I can just rent a server in Amazon's cloud, a couple $100, and I can have that thing cracked in about a day as well. Turns out that password length is one of the single best strength factors you can have for your password. And this is where tools like password managers really come in handy, where you can have them generate a really long, unique password for every single one of your accounts, and you don't have to try and memorize them. Want to pause real quick? Do we have any questions coming in right now, Don?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions that was asked was about password security, and if passwords need to be protected, what tools do you use? You mentioned, of course, password vaults, but I think probably one of the most critical protection methods for passwords is multi-factor. So you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, so password managers do a great job for protecting your credentials from being cracked in the event of a breach, but they don't protect you from just willingly giving up your username and password to a well-crafted phishing email sending you to a site that looks like a legitimate login portal. And so in order to protect against that style of authentication attack, you really have to use multi-factor authentication. And these days, it's easier than ever for companies of any size to set up multi-factor authentication. Cloud managed services have made it affordable and easy to manage and easy to use for users. When you are setting up multi-factor, though, not every type of multi-factor is the same in terms of security and usability. Like hardware tokens can be great security-wise, but it's really difficult to get them deployed out to a bunch of remote workers. SMS-based multi-factor is really quick and easy to use, aside from having to type in a number every single time, but it's just flat out not secure, and it's even been deprecated by NIST, which I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation. So you want to look at multi-factor that uses apps and push-based notifications, where that authentication confirmation request comes down over an encrypted channel that an attacker can't just break right into. And they tend to be really easy to use for end users as well. Really, you just log into the form like normal and then hit approve on your phone, because most of our users have phones these days, which makes it really easy to deploy that type of MFA. Anything else come through, Don?
Yeah, that's great.
Or anything you want to add?
That addressed all the other questions. Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. So our final threat category that we need to watch out for is remote employees. And we actually did a research study recently with Site Research, and we found that 90% of mid-sized enterprises have employees working half their week outside the office. And like I made a joke earlier that this is mostly the fault of millennials who hate commuting into the office. But the reality is we are starting to see more of a distributed workforce. And like with the recent coronavirus scare, this is even more obvious and applicable than ever, where massive organizations and even smaller organizations are starting to shut down and require their users work remotely. And when it comes to security, we always advocate for what we call a layered security approach, where you have security defenses all the way from your network perimeter down to the endpoints. And if you take that endpoint out of your network now, you're potentially missing out on a lot of those layers of security, and you need to make sure you have other tools and training in place to back them up. So when it comes to securing a mobile workforce, some of the risks you have to watch out for is malware and ransomware, for example, where when you bring that laptop out of your perimeter, you no longer have your perimeter security there scanning and trying to identify threats before they reach the endpoint. And you also run the risk where that employee might get their laptop infected while they're sitting at a coffee shop or an airport, and then they might bring it back into the office. And if you don't have tools that can assess the health of that system and prevent an infected workstation from connecting to the network, it could allow this malware infection to spread across behind your perimeter now. Phishing and spear phishing is another big risk when it comes to mobile users, because there's an increased reliance on non-face-to-face communication. Like most mobile workers will communicate over chat or email as opposed to face-to-face communications. And it's really hard for me to phish someone when I'm looking them in the eyes, but it's a lot easier for me to phish them if they're just using email to communicate. And another risk area within phishing and spear phishing is mobile devices, which I guess this still falls under working in the office too. Like I do most of my email on my mobile phone, but there's genuine phishing risks with that, because mobile Outlook and mobile email clients tend to hide a lot of information that might set off red flags for a phishing email or something that got spoofed that arrives in your inbox. And another issue when it comes to mobile workers is insecure remote access. A lot of IT administrators take the easy way out and just forward in like RDP access or remote access to different services and leave them exposed to the internet. Another big risk is insecure wireless networks. So if you're connecting from a coffee shop or a airport, for example, you might not have the same level of protection as, say, connecting over your own secure connection back at home. And this kind of bundles up with VPN avoidance, where if you're connecting over an insecure wireless network and you're not using a VPN, an attacker could potentially man in the middle of your connection and inject malicious JavaScript into websites you visit, or sniff credentials out of applications you're using on your phone, and then use that to attack other services that you use. Don, was there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to comment on, and this is something that we just recently came across. It was an organization that had deployed firewalls at a couple of home users' houses to allow them to have a secure network link back into the business network when they worked from home. They wanted a hardware-based firewall solution. The client also, we used a SIEM platform. We used Alien Vault for their security monitoring. The minute we deployed those firewalls, we found that on the home users' home networks that were already hackers. They were already using tools. They'd already penetrated their home networks. So in some situations, amazingly, even with a firewall at the edge in a home user or remote office, if you don't control the rest of that network, there's a risk. So last thing I'd say about remote workers is just dropping a firewall in their house doesn't necessarily protect you. So in that situation, our recommendation is to use a software VPN, not a hardware VPN, because you don't want their IoT, their Ring doorbell, their camera system, and all that stuff on your corporate network, which it is when it's on a hardware VPN.
Yeah, and it's difficult enough to get people to segment their IoT in an office environment. It is next to impossible to convince someone to segment their IoT at home.
Yeah, it's impossible.
Exactly.
Yeah. One other question.
That is a great point.
Yeah, is it safe to use a VPN over a personal hotspot? My answer to that is if you're doing a software VPN, the level of safety is dramatically higher. And the reason is because, of course, now you're bringing it back to the firewall and you're not connecting it LAN to LAN. You don't have a layer 3 connection. It's all up at a higher layer because you're doing it via software. You have any comments on personal hotspot usage for VPNs?
Yeah, so obviously a personal hotspot is more secure than connecting over, say, like an open wireless network at a coffee shop. But using a VPN to get, say, back to the office is a great security benefit that you should be using. Because, for example, if you're VPNing back to the home office, now you're back behind that perimeter, you can get a lot of perimeter security. And then a VPN in general can help protect you from someone sniffing out unencrypted traffic over the wireless network. Always use a VPN when possible.
Oh, I agree. What about two more questions? One is using a VPN over public Wi-Fi. Let's say I'm out at, everybody seems to mention Starbucks, but I'm at a Starbucks or at a hotel. Do you think it's safe to use a VPN, or do you think VPNs can be compromised in those scenarios?
No, I would say it's safe and highly recommended to use a VPN in those scenarios, if not flat out required.
Yeah.
The authentication from the VPN is secure. It's not going to transmit your password in plain text. And then once you're protected by that encrypted tunnel, anyone else on that network isn't going to be able to see your network traffic anymore,
right.
Which is critical to keeping yourself safe.
One thing just on that, and I've got one more question that comes through the chat window. One thing on that we should look out for is a trend in the future with Wi-Fi 6 and other technologies, just so you know, is hopefully over the coming years, something called client isolation. So a lot of Wi-Fi manufacturers makes more secure wireless than others. So if you get a garden variety, home quality, Best Buy, Netgear, Ubiquity, whatever, they're not going to offer client isolation. What that means is if I'm on Wi-Fi, you're on Wi-Fi, we can actually see each other's traffic. Client isolation means even without a VPN, you can't see anyone else's traffic. But you can't count on these public networks to do client isolation. So VPN is the best possible protection technology. A couple other quick ones come through. One is, could someone grab your VPN keys during the initial handshake session? If you're on a public Wi-Fi, you try to establish a VPN, is there a possibility they could grab those and exploit it? And couldn't they then spoof that connection?
No, they cannot. So if you're using like an IPsec VPN, it's protected by a handshake that the way the key is negotiated, it's impossible for someone in the middle to identify the key you're using. Same with a SSL VPN, one of the more common ones. The way that your encryption key is negotiated between you and the server, it uses a protocol, a handshake protocol like Diffie-Hellman, for example, that it's literally impossible for someone to steal the key. So it's not a concern you have to watch out for, luckily. And by using a VPN, now you don't have to worry about them man-in-the-middling anything on your connection over that wireless network.
That's right.
And I did want to add something to client isolation.
Yep.
We've actually started seeing malware now that abuses wireless networks that don't have client isolation, where, like, let's say you're in a coffee shop, if someone's infected with this malware, it'll go out and try to connect to every single other system on that wireless network.
Right.
It can use password lists to try and brute force access into those computers, and then once it's installed, continue spreading from there. It's absolutely insane, and why client isolation is so important.
Yeah, client isolation is vital, and unfortunately, a lot of businesses just aren't really providing safe Wi-Fi. So it's making the VPN a absolute necessity if you're going to do any computing on somebody else's wireless. One of the questions that come through was it's kind of it's a one-parter, but I want to break it into two parts. And the question was really, is using something like Dell's SRA solution more secure than a standard VPN client? And I want to address that by first of all saying VPN clients are secure. VPNs at their core use a certificate exchange technology, and they've never been cracked. They've never been cracked. These certificates are essentially unhackable at this point, have never been cracked. And so the way they exchange that data, as it was mentioned earlier, it's uncrackable. They can't jump in the man in the middle. They can't then spoof it. That's really bulletproof. As far as SRA goes, it's just another secure remote access technology. It at its heart, it's also using VPN. It's just doing it via web instead of client. So also a good option.
Exactly. Until we have people walking around with quantum computers as laptops, you don't have to worry about people cracking your VPN.
It's going to happen. My kids will have it, right?
Probably someday soon. We'll see.
Yep. Definitely for gaming. Xbox 5. Quantum.
Exactly. So let's go ahead and hop into some more defensive tips for some of those trends. And the first one I've already mentioned a few times, and that's the defense in depth. There is no such thing as a silver bullet when it comes to security. I would love to tell you that you can buy one single product or service or turn on this one thing and you are completely unhackable. It's simply not true. Eventually, there will be some zero-day vulnerability or some new malware evasion that will allow it to slip through one of your cracks, and you want to make sure that you have another layer behind there to back it up. So that means multiple different layers of anti-malware, from even traditional signature-based anti-malware to quickly catch the known bad stuff, to then malware that'll use machine learning or AI or cloud SAN-based options in order to detect the more evasive threats that might make it through your other layers of security. A great example of this was with WannaCry. So when WannaCry started happening in around May, it was exploiting vulnerabilities that we already knew about from over a month prior. And for example, we had intrusion prevention service signatures that could detect and block attempted exploitations of those vulnerabilities. But let's say you didn't have IPS enabled, or a hypothetical scenario where it was a zero-day exploit that we didn't know about. Well, even then, in the case of WannaCry, it was ransomware, and because it was ransomware, a lot of our ransomware signatures were able to detect and block variants of it, even using just signatures in this case. 4 signatures caught 20 or so variants. But WannaCry, unfortunately, had polymorphic code. There were a lot of variants of it, which meant that we also had to use tools like APT Blocker, which is a definitive send it up into the cloud, detonate it, and give a thumbs up or thumbs down on if it's malicious. So in this case, 3 different layers of blocking the same exact threat, so that if one of them happened to not catch it, you had another layer behind it in order to block it from getting through. I mentioned that 207 mean time to identify stat earlier in this presentation. And a lot of that is fueled by us putting too much of our budget and attention on the prevention portion of security, which is why a lot of experts and analysts are recommending rebalancing towards detection and response now too, so that if something does slip through, it's not going to take you 9 months to detect it while it's sitting there wreaking havoc on your network. And when it comes to detection and response, you want to make sure you avoid siloed solutions. So look for ones that can share information between different stages so that you can try and predict future attacks from occurring as well. Now, when it comes to specific defenses for those 5 categories I gave you, I want to be cognizant on time, so I'll go a little quickly through here, but really it boils down to, with ransomware, good anti-malware protections, and that means multiple layers of anti-malware defenses so you can catch even the most evasive versions. Multi-factor authentication is another really critical thing, even with ransomware, because we want to make sure we keep our accounts locked down so that an attacker can't just authenticate and walk right in through the front door. And then good endpoint detection and response or remediation that will watch for malicious behaviors and hopefully stop ransomware before it's able to start encrypting all of your files. And you want to make sure that you have off-perimeter protection as well because of our mobile workforce that we're all starting to move towards. When it comes to fileless malware, intrusion prevention systems can stop the exploits of network services to stop it from spreading. Advanced malware detection tools that can detonate like Office documents up in the cloud can do a good job of detecting this type of threat before it reaches the endpoint. And then once it's on the endpoint, good endpoint detection and response tools that don't just watch for bad things, but also watch good processes that might start doing malicious actions so that you can identify a compromised process and stop it from taking out the whole computer. When it comes to spear phishing, multi-factor authentication is another big one, so that even if your users willingly give up their username and passwords to a well-crafted phish, the attacker isn't able to log into the computer without going and breaking into their house and stealing their mobile phone. Phishing awareness training is also critical. You're never going to get the click rate down to 0%, but if you can get your click rate from the industry average of 30 down to like the single digits, you give a lot more breathing room for your technical defenses to pick up the slack and try and catch those last few attacks. DNS firewalling is another really good technical defense for phishing. Services like DNS Watch that we have can help neuter those malicious links. And in our case, instead of sending them to the original malicious domain when they click on that link, we send them to a safe black hole where they're actually given phishing training right there in the moment, like a short little 5-minute, oops, you clicked on a phish, here's a video or a game for you to play so that you don't accidentally do this again. When it comes to account compromise and account takeovers, again, MFA is the single best thing that you can do to protect yourself from this type of threat. Phishing awareness training goes a long way to stopping users from giving up their passwords, and then good advanced anti-malware detection in order to stop threats like Mimikatz and Windows Credential Editor from just stealing passwords right off of your computer. One thing when it comes to passwords, NIST, the governing body for the standards that a lot of government contractors have to use, actually just updated their password guidelines with some really interesting additions. For example, they no longer advocate for arbitrary password expiration periods, and instead they say if you're using multi-factor authentication, you shouldn't be forcing your users to reset their password every like 90 days or so, because that just encourages bad password practices. They're less likely to create a strong, unique password if they have to keep resetting it. Instead, they'll probably just increment some number on it. So now bad password 2 becomes bad password 3. Also, no arbitrary complexity requirements when paired with multi-factor authentication. Just encourage strong, long, unique ones without arbitrary, no 2 same letters in a row, or it has to have this many uppercase letters, stuff like that. They recommend checking passwords against known password breach lists so that your users aren't reusing an already breached password. And then I mentioned earlier, they already deprecated SMS as a form of multi-factor authentication because it's just not secure. That said, it's better than nothing. So if SMS is your only option for MFA, still use it. But if you have any other option for multi-factor, use that instead.
If I could just...
And then remote employees, mobile
sorry.
VPN.
I know we're running a little long time, just chime in there. One thing that I wanted to reiterate, and this is, I know all of us can feel incredibly frustrated by this at times. A lot of stuff we're talking about is for real security. We want you to be secure and be protected and be defending your network. I know that there's real world implications in terms of convenience and also compliance. So to Marc's point about NIST guidelines regarding password expiration and complexity, if you're using MFA specifically as well, you know, you're going to have to balance that against compliance for your industry. Because I know a couple of our clients have run into that where the outside auditors have said, yeah, whatever, you're still going to have to do it anyway. So MFA number one, just pretty please the sugar on top, get it anywhere for free, even if you have to, but get that. And then if you do, you may still need to do password complexity and change just because of compliance requirements for your industry, and unfortunately no way to dodge that. Lastly, there's one other one, which is about how do you check the passwords from breached passwords. So to the specific person that asked that question, we are doing already doing dark web monitoring on your domain, and that's how we check those breached passwords. And so for you, we're actually monitoring those breach passwords through our dark web monitoring. I'm glad to give you that. You'll see it. But for most people that don't have it, you definitely want to get some kind of dark web intelligence or dark web monitoring reoccurring service looking at your different email domains. That's really what you're trying to gather is the email domain. That's the number one most critical thing to protect is the email address linked to a password. So there's a lot of dark web monitoring tools out there. I'd be glad to do a free one, initial free one for you, just as a scan. Just ping me and let me know. We'll do a free dark web monitor on whatever domains you have, send you the report and tell you what we see there. And then it's very inexpensive to get dark web monitoring. You know, one domain, if you got a couple hundred email addresses, you might spend, you know, $100 a month. So it's not a terribly expensive tool to do that monitoring.
Yep. And I like that you mentioned the compliance requirements for passwords. Until they catch up, you definitely still want to follow the compliance requirements. I am fully on board with this recommendations, though, and I hope the compliance thing like PCI and HIPAA start catching up with that, too. When it comes to securing remote employees, use a mobile VPN. Don't just port forward traffic to whatever services they need. Protect it behind either a mobile VPN client or a clientless VPN portal. Endpoint protection is critical as well to make sure that their workstations are protected when they're outside the perimeter. And you want to make sure that that endpoint protection has stuff like host containment, so that if that computer does get infected somehow, if they bring it back into the office, it's not going to be allowed onto the network until it's been remediated. Multi-factor authentication and phishing training, as with just about every other threat out there, is super important for remote employees too. So make sure you've got those running in your office too. So that was it. If you guys do have any further questions, my inbox is always open for security questions. Same with Twitter and whatever LinkedIn does. And then as a self-plug, check out the 443. It's our weekly podcast where we talk about the latest security threats and how they might affect your organization.